Hello, everybody. This is the first podcast lecture burst that I'm going to do covering chapter 13. This first one is going to deal primarily with the role of genetics on personality as well as Freud and psychoanalysis. So, as you'll see, I'm not going to go through every single slide. I will skip some here and there, mostly so I can get through the main points of what the take-home message is for this lecture burst. So if we look at personality as a whole, we know that, like the dwarfs, everyone has a distinct personality, and we can think of personality as being sort of the organization or our enduring behavior patterns that we have that serve to distinguish us from one another. Personality in that frame of reference involves a very distinctness or uniqueness of character. So, as a personality psychologist, one would study those individual differences and constructs and seek to test and measure those differences and see what the differences are in personality and what kind of evolves from that. Personality is again that enduring behavior pattern, so thus it's very consistent and predictable. Usually our character is. If you know of a friend you might have that's a very good friend, you might be able to predict with a certain amount of certainty how he or she might respond in given situations. You know who this person is, you know how they act, you know what their traits are. So we can expect people to stay somewhat consistent over time. And this is why it's so cool when we see an old friend that we haven't seen in a while. We kind of think of them in the ways that we knew them. And a lot of that does stay the same, even though circumstances have changed and they may have changed a little bit. The enduring behavior pattern remains. And then finally, personality involves sort of an internal coherence or like a unified organization of character that embraces who the whole person is. So some of the main questions that personality theorists strive to answer might be, is personality inherited or learned? Do humans have free will in how they act? Is there a self? What is that self? What is self-knowledge? And personality theorists are in a unique position to study the whole person rather than just development or learning or memory, some of the other topics we've covered, intelligence, motivation. So in the course of their work, they're going to address fundamental issues of human nature and individual differences. The biology of personality really starts with behavioral genetics, which is basically just the study of heredity and personality. And we know that selective breeding of animals can lead to predictable temperaments. We can selectively breed animals to have certain traits, and then we can predict then what their temperament might be on those traits. So it gives us a good sense of how we can fine-tune specific traits. And when we look at twin and adoption studies, we get even more information. These types of studies that have looked at identical twins separated at birth and adopted into different families. We've seen a lot of support for a genetic influence on many personality traits like intelligence, traditionalism, nurturing, empathy, assertiveness, neuroticism, and extroversion, which we're going to be looking at as key traits. And so by comparing adopted children to their adoptive parents and siblings, researchers really uncover some of the shared and non-shared environmental and genetic influences on personality. Identical and fraternal twins differ in the way that they express big five personality factors, which we're going to talk about in another lecture burst. But the scores of identical twins have about a 50% correlation, whereas those of fraternal twins, which are no more similar than you and any other sibling, correlate only about 15 to 20%. So those kinds of findings give support to the idea that at least some aspects of personality are genetically based. And so the current findings on the heritability of personalities suggest that variations in personality traits are about 25 to 50% inherited. It's about how much we gain in our genes from our parents. And that leaves the other half of the pie, so to speak, to environmental and cultural influences on us. Now, there are 4 traditional perspectives when we take a look at personality. Each one of these perspectives helps to examine and understand how personality operates. We have psychodynamic perspective, behavioral, humanistic, and traits. So each one of these is going to be a different lecture burst. I'm going to start talking about Freud. I might have to break his up because this psychodynamic one is kind of one of the largest perspectives. There's a lot to say here, but I'm going to break up our lecture into these 4 areas of understanding personality. So psychodynamic perspective, to begin, starts with Sigmund Freud, whom a lot of you have heard of, and it still exists today. It focuses on the role of our unconscious mind in the development of personality, that the unconscious plays a huge role there. This perspective is also pretty heavily focused on biological causes of personality differences. And then just to kind of overview, the behavioral perspective is based on theories of learning, like we discussed in the learning chapter, and it focuses on the effect of the environment on behavior, so not the unconscious, but the environment. Humanistic perspective, it first arose actually as a reaction against psychodynamic and psychoanalytic perspectives, as well as even the behaviorist perspectives, because it focuses more on the role of each person's conscious life experiences and choices and personality development. So unlike Freud, where Freud said that a lot of what drives us are these unconscious urges we're not even aware of, humanistic perspectives is fully immersed in the person's conscious life choices and experiences, that we each have the ability to craft our own world, and this crafts how our personality develops. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that perspective. And then trait perspective differs from all 3 of those previous mentioned ones, in that all of the prior 3 perspectives seek to explain the process that causes personality to form, like where does it come from, why are we all so unique, whereas trait theorists, those who see a personality from the trait theory perspective, are more concerned with the end result, like the characteristics themselves, like who are we, what does that mean? So although some trait theorists assume that traits are biologically determined, others don't make that assumption. So that kind of varies there a little bit, but they're more focused on, okay, well, what are the pieces of our personality and how do we see them play out? So that's your overview. Let's get into Freud at least a little bit here, and then into the next lecture burst, I'll do some more. So psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective is Freud. All of his clinical work led him to develop this very comprehensive theory. It includes 3 kind of key pieces. One is the unconscious mind, the other being psychosexual stages of development that we go through in early childhood and adolescence, and then the use of defense mechanisms to protect the ego, as he would say, and protect our sense of self. So let's kind of get into some of these. Freud believed in free association, which is basically just your chain of thoughts. And he believed that as we explore our chain of thoughts and just kind of let our thoughts wander wherever they may go, they may lead us to painful past experiences, embarrassing unconscious memories that consciously we're not aware of, but that we've tucked away in the reservoir of our mind. And he said that once those memories are brought up and released, that's where treatment occurs, psychoanalysis. It's now analyzing those thoughts, those chain of thoughts. And that this analysis is what helps patients to feel better, to resolve some of that unconscious angst, as he would say. So Freud's primary method of therapy was psychoanalysis, and the goal of it being to help a patient release the memories and thoughts that might be holding him or her back. And once the person does that, they're going to go ahead and feel better, feel cured, even, he would say, of mental illness, which Freud was a big proponent that mental illness stemmed from repressed issues, things you hadn't dealt with, and they were seeping out or leaking out. Freud also argued that unacceptable thoughts that we have, thoughts that are not okay in our culture or society, feelings, memories, that those kind of lay just below the surface, beneath our conscious awareness, that we sort of repress them because they are unsettling to acknowledge. They are sometimes painful. He argued that although we're not aware of these feelings and thoughts on a conscious level, they still have a powerful influence over us, and that those sometimes get expressed, but in a disguised way. So it might be the work that we choose, the beliefs that we hold, our daily habits, troubling symptoms that we're having physiologically. And he believed that he could get a glimpse into our unconscious through those things, through these thoughts, by seeping into people's free association, that their beliefs and habits and symptoms would leak out via slips of the tongue, if you've ever heard that, a slip of the tongue. You say something you didn't mean, but it actually might have an underlying meaning. So Freud would say that those slips of the tongue were motivated by those sort of unconscious conflicts that's going on for the person. And he'd say that, maybe there's a hidden motive that could presumably be found for even the most innocuous mistake a person might make in what they say. And this is what he would investigate via his psychoanalytic methods. So there's a lot to be said there. We're going to break it up into sort of pieces here. What is Freud's structure for the mind, this unconscious reservoir? So we're going to break down the psyche according to Freud, and it's best to be seen as an iceberg. As you can tell with an iceberg, most of it is hidden below the surface. A boat traveling up here might look at this little piece here and go, oh, it's not so bad. But they don't know what's hiding underneath, right? Hence, sort of what happened to the Titanic. So it's a pre-conscious store of like memories, he would say, lurking under there. So the different pieces of Freud's mind would be the result of our efforts to resolve conflicts between our biological drives or impulses, which he called the id, and that which socially restrains us culturally, which he called the superego. So it's sort of like the devil and the angel sitting on a person's shoulder, and then the id plays the mediator between those, trying to find common ground for the person, where the person's going to feel comfortable. And I always like to use this little picture of Homer, the angel and the devil. The id is striving so hard to satisfy basic urges, desires, intensities, sexual aggression, aggressive drives, and it operates off the pleasure principle. If it feels good, great, all the better. And that it seeks for that gratification, and it demands it. It doesn't care what it has to do to get it, or who it has to step on, or if it's okay, or if it's going to hurt somebody. The superego is the opposite, right? So it's striving for standards and judgment. It's the conscious. It's taking into account future aspirations, and it's trying to quell unnecessary desires that could be wrong. And then there's the ego is mediating both the demands and trying to find the middle ground.